Thank you to the Open Source Business Forum for having me on. The title of my talk today is 0 to 1 from open source project to business. One of the most incredible things about the rise of open source businesses is becoming the great equalizer for company building. Companies like Elastic, Automatic, and GitLab are showing that contributors are truly distributed, and thus building companies in the open decreases the friction for talent, customers, and partners around the world to help build a successful business. This is a big reason why I think we are seeing the proliferation of open source European companies today. A little bit about me. I'm Shomik Ghosh, a principal at Boldstart Ventures. You can follow me on Twitter at ShomikGhosh21, and also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email as well. At Boldstart, we are first check day one partners for technical enterprise founders. Our later stage companies, which some of you may have heard of, are listed on the right side. And we are increasingly finding more and more companies in Europe, many of which are not announced yet. But Sneak, Front, and Big ID are examples of thriving companies that either are headquartered or at least have a significant presence in Europe. We also have experience with many open source companies, such as the ones listed below, and also many others that are still in stealth. Although frankly, even though they're in stealth, they all have active developer communities. Since we partner with companies at the pre-product or early in product stage, this talk will be about the tactics to go from an idea to a business with early traction. So a framework that I like to use when thinking about building an open source business is SCUBA. We'll dive into each of the points you see here further in later slides, but for now, SCUBA is an easy acronym that represents scope out what value open source brings to your users, create in the open, understand your community, build out your distribution, and activate your community. And we'll talk a little bit more about what all those mean in later slides. Here are some sample questions to go with scoping out the value of open source to your users. And if you're thinking about either starting an open source business or deciding whether to turn an open source project into a business, these are important questions to ask. These lead to different org structure decisions and business decisions. And I'll give an example from our portfolio. So M0 is a portfolio company based in Israel that is building a platform enabling developers to spin up self-service cloud environments. Although they did not start building the core product in open source, they recently decided to open source a key product into the Terraform community. TerraTag allows developers to easily tag cloud resources within your existing infrastructure as code. The decision behind open sourcing this was because developers would get immediate value out of the feature. And also, feature requests will now spread the product into other environments, such as Oracle Cloud or IBM Cloud, ones that the M0 team did not yet design the product for. And other contributors will be able to work on adding these resources, which again means like you're building in the open. Finally, developers want to make sure that they understand the code base before allowing it into their infrastructure as code. They want to understand the security risks, they want to understand the dependencies in order to adopt this. And so that's the reason really why M0 decided to open source TerraTag. However, the additional benefit is M0's core product now gets further recognition within the developer community, which leads to more customers down the road. However, it's important to say that the decision did not start based on more customers, but rather what value would this product, being open source, deliver to individual developers and in what community and ecosystem. And these are the important decisions to think through as you're thinking about building an open source business. If you are committed to building an open source business and not just a project, then you must go all in on truly creating in the open. One of the common mistakes I see is companies open sourcing the code and then saying, we're just going to let the code do the talking. You are competing against work from home, family, other open source projects, and frankly, even Fortnite and many other things. So the goal really should be to decrease the friction for a user to understand the value and why this product is worth their time. A good example of this is Backstage, a service catalog built for microservices, open sourced by Spotify. As you can see, they invested in formatting, images, a transparent public roadmap, and significant documentation. This will take a lot of early resources, and as we all know, few people like to write documentation. But doing this properly from day one will greatly increase adoption compared to putting out the bare minimum. Another plus is one of the hardest things in building an open source business is truly understanding the traction. So when done transparently, you can actually put telemetry into the open source to understand usage on a granular level. Some developers will disable it, but if the justification for it is written out clearly, I've seen it work wonders. While there are varying levels of resources that you will commit to these aspects at different stages of the company, if you're going to create in the open, you need to commit to doing everything in the open at the highest quality possible at that time. And so yes, even if you are a seed stage company, you need to think carefully about what is that description that you're going to use in the opening sentence for GitHub, and also what landing pages or what documentation you can commit to at this time to make sure that that time to value is easily identifiable for anybody coming to the project. So understanding your community, community is a broad term, but generally let's call it working closely with early adopters and creating a welcoming space for others to come in, whether by a referral or frankly just stumbling upon the open source project through a Hacker News article. You're basically creating serendipity. And the great thing about users or contributors that are coming to your open source project at this time is they're really hobbyists or at least enthusiasts that were intrigued by something. Your goal is really to find out what that is and see if it correlates to others. Take every opportunity to engage, whether in writing or verbally, with your users and spend time one-on-one. You are building relationships with others who are just as excited about this solution as you. So this is actually kind of the fun part about the job. A great example is actually from Optic, a developer tooling company creating APIs that test and document themselves. The team is early in its journey, but has a separate community tab on its websites and is taking a less scalable approach to engaging with users purposefully. The team has actually set up Slack channels with certain users, but also still wants to have one-on-one detailed office hours or sessions to learn about all the pain points users are experiencing. This also benefits users by letting them learn best practices from Optic's team's deep domain expertise and APIs. It's a classic example of doing things that don't scale in the beginning to understand the user deeply and then expand from there. Building an engaged community and building distribution rely upon each other. In order to build a community, first you need an open source product that people care about. Next, you engage that community, and then to keep them engaged and build new community, you need to build out a distribution infrastructure. Users want to engage in products that have staying power, so separate landing pages with thoughtful design lends more legitimacy to the staying power of the business and project. There are multiple ways to attack distribution. Personally, I think DevRel hires can greatly accelerate this, and they can do this by showing the community and new users how they incorporate the product into their workflows, why it is so useful, and also share best practices. They basically act as the customer voice, as well as further helping with community pain points. The goal of all of this is, again, to decrease the cognitive load to use the product and engage with the business. Two examples are the companies that we have here, Replicated and Tina CMS. Replicated enables SaaS companies to deploy products on-prem. The team has spun up an entirely different website and resource, including the Enterprise Ready podcast, to help others better build enterprise features. They are showing their usefulness not only as an open source product, but also with their expertise. And it's paying dividends. Customers have come in completely untouched through the sales process by either finding the website or engaging on the podcast and then diving into Replicate. So it's really powerful, and this is how you kind of build a large business. Tina CMS, which stands for This Is Not a CMS, is an open source editor for React-based sites and has a separate landing page with further resources outside the GitHub repo to better help exploring this area. Notice the time invested into not only the content, but the design in both of these cases. If you're going to create in the open and want to build distribution, it is important to invest time to deliver the wow moment to potential users. I really enjoyed this graphic by Danelle from Battery Ventures. It clearly shows how large open source companies can become. This graph was showing the difference between ways that these companies chose to deploy their products. There are actually many ways to approach monetization that frankly could take a whole separate presentation to talk through, and I'm sure someone else is actually doing that as one of their talks. But in general, there are 4 buckets. Open core, which involves selling enterprise features on top of the open source offering. A cloud solution where the business hosts the product for the customer. Self-hosted or on-prem. And a straight services offering where you are helping the company implement the product, most commonly known as the Red Hat model. What I take away from the graph, though, is not how quickly cloud is ramping, but really what is driving the demand on both the on-prem and the hosted side. And what's interesting is that it took a long time for both of these to start going really quickly. On the on-prem side, obviously that started first, so that's why there's a longer time to ramp. But still, you can see that that curve is fairly flat in the beginning and then starts to really ramp up exponentially. And so the answer is, well, you probably guessed it, it's community. It's all about securing the end user love and understanding their pain points and blockers to then get to the budget owner and technical decision maker to enable a sale. And those 2 personas are very important, and in many cases actually different individuals. So it's important to kind of keep those in mind. As discussed earlier, creating a community takes a long time. You just have to let it bake in the oven. And for most of the open source companies that I've engaged with, it takes about 3 years of evangelism, engagement, and building before the community is of a sizable enough scale to drive meaningful customer traction. Keeping the end user in mind is also what keeps driving growth in the future. Snyk, for example, first launched its product that helps developers use open source code securely alongside their open source CLI command line interface client. They continue to focus on the developer and 5 years later have driven significant value by launching new products that continually focus on delivering clear, frictionless value to the end user, in their case, the developer. The developer community continues to pay off in the future as the companies they're working for mature into paying customers, they leave to work at other companies, or just spread word within other communities that Snyk has the easiest to use developer security product. It is very important to not try and monetize too early in these cases. The issue is typically paying customers will take you into specific needs that may not be broadly applicable. They also may be time consuming to build those specific features. Additionally, they may have feature requests that when built in will increase the complexity of the OSS product. When that occurs, the friction for new users has been increased, and if you do not have the infrastructure built out from a distribution, community engagement, and internal team perspective to walk these users through the more complex product, they will leave and not become adopters. Thus, you're losing the long tail of future customers. It's a really delicate balance to be mindful of. So finally, just as a reminder, SCUBA is a great framework to use when considering building an open source business or turning an open source project into a business. 15 minutes is a short time to cover everything in enough detail, but I'm always happy to discuss more, so please reach out on Twitter, LinkedIn, or by email if you'd like to chat further. And with that, I think we open up for questions.